Now, you had lunch with him on Thursday last week when he was to find out later that day, I think, about these allegations. When you saw him, clearly he didn't know anything about them. I mean, how was he?
Well, he just got a very early train back from Edinburgh. I think he said it was 4:45, something like that, into King's Cross, because he'd been up for the BBC reporting on the Scottish Crown Jewel ceremony with the King. I think he'd gone back home. He'd changed. He was wearing a sweater in the Wolsey, which is a sort of fashionable restaurant in Piccadilly in central London, and he was in high spirits, I thought, and very quite gossipy about royal protocol and so on. Certainly not with a man with a tremendous dark cloud hanging over him.
No, and then later, as you say, his world fell apart. What did you make of the way it came out in The Sun? I mean, it's your sister paper, but was it legitimate journalism, do you think?
I really can't speak to those editorial decisions. You have journalists on papers and news organisations and the BBC make editorial decisions all the time, and I know they wouldn't have gone with the story unless they were convinced that it was in the public interest and true. But personally speaking, I was incredibly shocked by it. It flew against everything I thought I knew about the man. You try and pride yourself as a professional interviewer that you can get to the truth of people or quite near it. I'd interviewed him twice. I'd had 2 long lunches with him. This was a man who talked about his family an awful lot, spoke very lovingly of his wife and his children as they were setting off at university and into their careers. Asked about my family. We even talked about going for a walk later this summer along the South Wales coast, which he absolutely adores. So there's sort of terrible cognitive dissonance. I didn't believe it, partly because I didn't want to believe it.
I mean, it's interesting in the way this was dealt with by the BBC, given that the complaints were made several weeks earlier, before this family went to The Sun, because arguably, if the BBC had investigated properly, it could have perhaps been dealt with in a very different way internally for Huw Edwards.
Well, I wish they had made their inquiries a bit more speedily and had talked to him about them, and then the family would never have gone to the press, as I understand it. As for these allegations that were made on Newsnight last night about inappropriate messaging from Huw Edwards to younger members of staff in the BBC newsroom, I mean, that I'd have thought could well have been an HR, human resources matter rather than a matter for an investigation. But of course, in this context, we were starved. Journalism was starved of information for several days, and journalism went out and found out what it could.
I mean, what's your personal view? Do you think there's a way back for Huw Edwards, Andrew?
I'd love to think he would be behind that desk again in a few weeks or months, and presenting the election night. I somehow doubt it. What I really hope is that he will have a career in broadcasting beyond this, that he will continue to make documentaries. He's a marvellous documentary maker and presenter, especially on programmes like Wales, his homeland, about which he feels passionately. And if not that, then maybe a job in academia. His father was an academic and a historian. He admired his father very much. That might be another avenue for him to pursue, but he's got to get past, well, what is clearly a severe mental breakdown at the moment.
Yes, and on that we wish him well, clearly. I mean, what about the way, Andrew, that the BBC's reported this? John Sopel, a former colleague of Hugh's, says some of his former colleagues need to look at themselves for the way they've covered it, he said. He says it's a complicated private life, not a criminal one. I just wonder your thoughts on that.
I was surprised last night that Newsnight continued to investigate, especially given the fact that we know that he was in a hospital. The Sun said they wouldn't be carrying any more stories. It seemed to have been decent haste, but I can understand it from the BBC's point of view. if they zealously go after other public figures who've committed some kind of wrongdoing, to be seen to be independent, they have to do the same with their own. It's a terribly tangled web here. What I do think is that it involves all-round vulnerable people, a vulnerable young person who had a drug habit, other young people and inexperienced people, perhaps, and a disparity of power in the newsroom. If those rumours are right, those complaints are founded. But you can be a very highly paid and very famous and very respected television presenter and be a vulnerable person too. And I think we found that poor Huw is very vulnerable.